Hello, and welcome to Radical Engagement here at Varn Solo. And we approach the winding down of this series. I've done this series for about 2.5 years out of the 5 years I've been going. And it's been very interesting, but I've had a couple of things change my mind about it. One, I've lost the enthusiasm for long text. I want to talk to you about longer text because they're more substantive, but I don't want to read every word because when I do a series beyond 2 episodes, the viewer count drops dramatically. Even if I make an episode too long, some of these pieces would take 4 or 5 hours to cover in entirety, even if I was reading them and not making that much commentary. Two, there's something patronizing, as a friend of mine pointed out, about reading this to your audience. And one way, yes, I'm trying to model close reading to you. And I do think there's been a degeneration in the scholarship where people summarize things in an easy manner. But it's alienating to people who don't want to listen to me read a piece or want me to read it straight and then comment on it afterwards, in which case I'm basically doing an audiobook and I don't have a license for that, and B, that's not really the point of this either. So in light of all those things, we here at Varn Vlog, and by we I mean me because I'm a one-man operation with a community behind me that helps out on selecting of texts and whatnot, but doesn't necessarily do the editing or the scripting. I'm just going to do a lot more scripted episodes. Well, they're not truly scripted. I write outlines and I'm organizing notes that I have for essays and stuff that I never wrote over the past 4 or 5 years, are things that I wanted to say and wanted to kind of systematically walk through and haven't done so because of stuff like this. So in that vein, we are going to be kind of phasing this out. I want to finish the mug weeder because I like to finish what I started. There will be a series of shows for the private too, for the Patreons, where I still use text. There'll still be links in the show notes. In fact, I'm going to try to have links and working bibliographies in every show notes for a non-interview piece, because I want you to be able to check my homework, basically. And I want you to be able to engage. So if you disagree with my interpretation, you can just say so. We'll still be doing shows that are also key about key text. I'll still be talking, I may bring back the excavations reading series where I get a group of my patrons and we read a text together and talk about it. But this whole line by line explication thing, I think, has reached its limit for a while. I might decide to bring it back, but we'll see. On the solo shows, once I finish this up, and I think it'll take me about 2 to 3 more episodes to finish this up, we'll be pivoting towards more thematic things that kind of have the idea that I'm taking a question or an event or another YouTube video or whatever and developing a way to teach you some key theoretical frameworks, maybe some practical skills, maybe a little bit of history, give you that history in a concise way, give you the working bibliography in the show notes, put some links in the show notes, and you can go off and use it yourself to do contemporary analysis, and I will do some model analysis for you. This is very much still a pedagogical project, but it's one that's just going to assume you're not fucking morons. A couple of things, though, before I get into this. This show will never be a fly-by-minute hot take current event show. If you want that, I sometimes do that on my X account or on Bluesky, but it's not really what I'm interested in. It's not who I am. I call that left ambulance chasing. It's effective for getting eyes on your show. It's effective for building like low commitment parasocial engagement. It's bad for high commitment engagement. It's bad for educational engagement. You get too distracted in the rat beef. So with all that said, I want you to know that if you ask me to cover things on the show, if it's current events, I'm more likely to do it on This Is Revolution's panels when they want me on than I am here. That's not really what I do here. And while I do incorporate current events, or they do come up in the context of informal interviews, they're never going to be the main part of the show. So all that preamble aside, let's get into the Merg Reader section 1, which is the first chapter of Learn and Rediscover What's to Be Done by Lars Lih. We are on page 38 in the Mug Reader, page 27 if you're following along in the Lars Lih, in a section called Merger versus Continued Isolation. And that's where we're going to begin our readings today. So I'm going to pull that up so you can follow along. Merger versus Continued Isolation. Quote from Lars Lih. Long quote. In order to bring out the crucial importance of the social democratic merger, Kautsky stresses two partners. Socialism and the worker movement were originally separate. And remember why he's translating it in the worker movement, I think is strange, but I think we cover that in section 1, part 4 and 5. What we might call the foundation myth of social democracy describes how these two forces come together. Kautsky's rendition of the story served as a template for many other detailed accounts of the social democratic origins, including the one given by Lenin and What Is to Be Done. Now, we're going to have to accept that this myth has an element of truth to it, but it is almost like an ideological myth that's going on here. In the Erfurt program, Kautsky traces the growth of the workers' movement from its early beginnings in the Middle Ages. The driving force of the movement was always resistance to capitalist exploitation. The resistance grew more and more organized and effective, but the resistance in and of itself did not generate the realization of capitalist private property had to be abolished. I mean, because it wouldn't make sense. Capitalist private property in this time period wouldn't even have been a fully immersed, separate zone of development are a full mode. I mean, we're talking about before bourgeois revolutions make all this clear. To make this point, Kautsky sets out a thought experiment described earlier and describes a worker movement that remains separate from socialism until long after it takes political power. Remember, this is the kind of from necessity argument you get from Kautsky, which I think is both historically erroneous. Actually, it's not even good logic. But nonetheless, I guess it is a rhetorical myth that social democrats used to tell themselves, even in their revolutionary golden age. Back to Lars Lih. Just as the worker resistance in and of itself does not generate insights into the need of socialism, the possession of insights about socialism does not, in and of itself, generate the realization that only the militant workers' movement can bring it about. Kautsky's narrative of how socialism, brackets, our parentheses, equals all those advocated social control of the economy as the only answer to the problems of society and the problems of the poor in particular, comes to the workers' movement from without, and in other words, how socialism was originally separate from the workers' movement. But the intention of this narrative is not to laud the socialists. On the contrary, their haughty condescension towards the militant workers' movement, and indeed their overt fear of it, meant the workers' rejection of socialism as a bourgeois whim was entirely understandable. And indeed, this is a story also told by Engels in Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. From the early socialist point of view, the proletariat was much too crude and too raw to be credited with the capacity for independent political initiative. And when the workers' movement did come into existence in the 1830s, the socialists were hostile because the worker militancy threatened to scare off the bourgeois philanthropists and elite politicians whom socialists wanted to win over. The utopian rejection of the workers' movement can be illustrated with a North American example. Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward is a classic of utopian socialism, published in 1888. It contrasts the world of its time with the enlightened world of 2000, funnily enough. Bellamy makes no distinction between Labor Party's followers of the red flag and bomb-throwing anarchists. In the following exchange, the narrator who grew up in the world of the 19th century learns the point of view of the enlightened 20th century from the lips of his host, Dr. Lida. An editorial note. For Bellamy and other late Victorian utopias, see another book in the Ancient Historical Materialist book series, Beaumont, 2005. Quote from Bellamy. As we sat at the table, Dr. Lih amused himself with looking over the paper I brought in. There was in it, as in all newspapers of date, 1887, a great deal about labor troubles, strikes, lockouts, boycotts, the programs of the labor parties, and the wild threats of anarchists. By the way, said I, as the doctor read aloud some of these items, what part did the followers of the red flag take in the establishment of the new order of things? They were making considerable noise last thing I knew. They did nothing to do except hinder it, of course, said Dr. Lih. We've heard many of these things many such times. Dr. Lih then announces as a historical fact that the followers of the red flag were subsidized by the capitalists in order to delay reform. The narrator adds a footnote that this assertion is undoubtedly incorrect, even though it is only theory that makes intelligible their actions. Dr. Lih then explains that the National Party that ushered in the utopian system of 2000 had nothing to do with the labor parties. Many liberal nationalists would still go this way. The labor parties as such never had accomplished anything on a large or permanent scale. For purposes of a national scope, their basis as merely class organizations was too narrow. I mean, I still hear this today from even people I like. It was not until the rearrangement of the industrial and social systems on a higher ethical basis and for the more efficient production of wealth was recognized as an interest not of one class, but of equally all classes, of rich and poor, cultured and ignorant, old and young, weak and strong, man and woman, that there was any prospect that could be achieved. Kautsky lays great stress on this kind of hostility towards the militant labor on the part of the early socialists. Every worker socialist shared this hostility. The point of Kautsky's narrative is not that socialism was originally separate from the workers as such, but it was originally separate from the worker movement. Individual workers such as Wilhelm Wetling could and did become socialists, but that fact alienated them from the worker movement and kept them apart from militant day-to-day struggle. We might actually see something like this today in sections of the working class against other sections. An elemental unwuchtig class instinct hatred of the bourgeoisie made the early worker socialists reject any doctrine coming from it, and as a result, their own rough-hewn theories were crude and violent. Further, despite their hostility to bourgeois intellectuals, they themselves had no real faith in the worker movement. I'm never get used to saying that. This early form of proletarian socialism, like the patience and the confidence and strength needed to contemplate a long, drawn-out class struggle. I mean, many such cases today I will again add. Back to Lars Lih, it remained a form of utopian socialism, only instead of hoping, like the early utopian socialists, for a bourgeois millionaire to bankroll in New Jerusalem, it placed hopes of the revolution with a capital R that would give power to the small dictatorial groups of visionaries. And here we are talking mostly about the Blanquists. Any form of class structure beside an immediate call to the barricades was perceived as a betrayal of mankind. I think we see a lot of this on X today. Usually such worker revolutionaries ended up as anarchists, or if they do join in the day-to-day class circle, they forget about socialism altogether, which I think is far more common. This kind of elemental revolutionary militancy is one of the growing pains, Kinderkrankheit, of a genuine socialist worker movement, since it tends to crop up whenever the backwards recruits to the proletariat still lack the clear insight into social relations. The paradoxical conclusion of this discussion is that even socialism that grew directly out of the proletariat soil failed to overcome the gap between socialism and the worker movement, and I would add, still does today. How to overcome that gap, indeed conflict between socialism and the worker movement, ? Kautsky provides the answer in the basic passage that brings together the Communist Manifesto, social democracy, and the logic of the merger formula. In a paragraph that begins the climactic section entitled Social Democracy as the Merger of the Worker Movement with Socialism, let's begin. This is a long translated quote of Kautsky's. In order for the socialists and the worker movement to become reconciled and to become fused into a single movement, socialism had to break out of its utopian way of thinking. This was a world historical deed of Marx and Engels. The Communist Manifesto of 1847 laid the scientific foundations of a new modern socialism, or as we say today, social democracy, or as Engels would have liked to say, scientific socialism. By so doing, they gave socialism a solidity that turned what had hitherto been a beautiful dream of well-meaning enthusiasts into an earnest object of struggle, and also showed this to be the necessary consequence of economic development. One wishes such things were still true. To the fighting proletariat, they gave a clear awareness of its historical task, and they placed it in a condition to speed to its greatest goal as quickly and with as few sacrifices as possible. The socialists no longer had the task of freely inventing a new society, but, one quote from Kautsky, but rather uncovering its elements in existing society. No more did they have to bring about the salvation from misery to the proletariat from above, but they had to support its class struggle through its increasing insight in promoting its economic and political organizations, and in doing so, bring about as quickly and as painlessly as possible the day when the proletariat would be able to save itself. The task of social democracy is to make the class struggle of the proletariat aware of its aim and capable of choosing the best means to attain the aim. Zelby Vest and Zweckmäßig. I don't know why we do the thing that we always do with these translations and this occasionally throw German compound words untranslated as if that makes it clear. They're even to people who speak and read German. The heroic contribution of Marx and Engels can only come from people who have mastered all the modern scientific political economy and extended it further. In other words, bourgeois intellectuals, albeit very exceptional ones, people who saw their future in proletarianization. This is one reason for the failure of the early self-taught proletarian socialist. The necessary role of bourgeois intellectuals, however, begins and ends with Marx and Engels. Once the great insight is achieved, anybody can accept and pass on the good news, making thinking an almost passive fact, which is going to be a problem for the Second International, frankly, a big one. Furthermore, the great contribution of Marx and Engels should not be seen as a rejection, but of a synthesis of what went before. As Kautsky put it later, each of the warring socialist sects contain a little bit of truth, ein Stücken des Rechten, in which we can now see a version of sooner or later argument. The contribution of Marx and Engels is to bring clarity and insight to what was a previously instinctive grouping. Quote, at a glance at these beginnings of the early socialist organizations always reveal a chaotic germ, an uncertain instinctive seeking and groping of numerous proletarians, more perceptible, more prominent than the others, all moved forward on by the whole by the same tendency, but often displaying the most striking individual deviations. Such a picture is, for instance, presented by the beginning of the proletarian socialistic movement in the 30s and 40s of the 19th century. Had it not been for Marx and Engels, the teachings brackets of the League of Communists would have continued to remain in the stage of ferment for a long time. The two authors of the Communist Manifesto were only enabled to secure their dominant and determining position by the virtue of their mastery of the science of their times. The Whiggish nature of Kautsky's thinking is throughout, and it's a problem, but we'll come back here. I think Marx is more dialectical on this stuff. Kautsky's narrative stresses the original separation of socialism and the worker movement in order to bring out the absolute necessity of their merger. And this is not just an inspiring story of the past. It also defines the task of social democratic polemics in the present, and even at the present time. Some participants of both the worker movement and the socialist movement still refuse the great synthesis, and with the result, even their little bit of truth becomes debased. What was much a part of a one-sidedness in the past becomes dangerously harmful in the present. Now, interestingly, it is unclear whether Lih is just mirroring Kautsky's voice or saying this is true today, because that would thus endorse Kautsky's position almost wholeheartedly, which I don't think we can actually do in light of most of the second half of the 20th century. Thus, the merger narrative laid the foundation of a two-front polemical war aimed against all who defend the continuous isolation of either socialism or the worker movement. The technical term within the social democratic discourse for the effort to keep the working class struggle free from socialism was nur Gewerkschaftlerei, trade unions onlyism. What we might call is like the trade unions only class, or Gompersism in America would be close to it. A similar nerd term could have been coined for the bomb-throwing revolutionaries who continued to think that it was a waste of time to try to propagate and educate the workers as a whole prior to revolution. The two enemies of social democracy are often invoked by means of a national stereotype. Over here, we see the frantic French anarchist or syndicalist who scorns parliamentary politics. Over there, we see the stolid British trade unionist who is a brilliant organizer but openly rejects socialism. And somewhere in the middle, the German social democrat who was both solidly organized and inspired by the higher ideal. If we look only at the front in this polemical war, we come away with equally one-sided view of the social democratic outlook. The conclusion reached by Robert Stewart is very useful study of the French Marxists led by Jules Guedé and Paul Lafargue. The standard comment on the French Marxists is they flip-flop back and forth between sectarian hardline and an opportunist soft line. And honestly, that's even indicated in the letters of Engels and Marx to them. But we'll come back to that. After reading party literature throughout the period, Stewart stresses a rather continuity in the outlook, since we take into account the party's multiple targets. That's funny that we go to Stewart and not Marx and Engels, who spoke a lot about this, and actually probably why we believe the standard line. One aim of my commentary is to bring out in a similar way the continuing two-front political war in Lenin's Iskra-era writings, very much included in what is to be done. Insight and organization. Now that we have witnessed the origins of the Great Synthesis, we can look at social democracy as the active force that works to bring about the merger. I mean, I don't know that you convinced me that the Great Synthesis is actually all that clear. I see why it's needed. I see that Kautsky is dealing with some of the same problems of Marx and Engels and trying to develop this out, but the automaticity and necessity arguments are actually pretty big hindrances. All right, back to the piece. The goals are summarized by the eloquent German words Kautsky used in the passage just cited. Selbst Zweckmusig. Aware of one's aim and capable of choosing the best means to attain it. Well, I see why that would be translated as a sentence. Or as Kautsky elaborated in 1889, social democracy is the party of the militant proletariat. It seeks to enlighten it, to educate it, to organize it, to expand its political and economic power by every available means, to conquer every position that can possibly be conquered, and thus provide it with the strength and maturity that will finally enable it to conquer all political power and overthrow the rule of the bourgeoisie. Out of Kautsky's extensive discussions of the topic, we were concentrated on the themes with the most important impact on the Russian social democracy. This includes the primordial importance of political freedom, the strength of the clear final goals it gives to the struggle here and now, the high value given to party organization and discipline, and the social democrat's own exhausted sense of mission. The social democratic mission of executing and organizing on a national level is crippled at the onset if political freedom is absent. Secret organizations are highly ineffectual as substitutes for open, often public, ones for the purposes of nationwide class struggle. It's just hard to run a clandestine organization that can operate nationwide and teach people openly. It's kind of hard to do. The crucial weapon of the socialist press is particularly dependent on political freedom. Quote from Kautsky. To bring these masses into contact with another, to awaken their awareness of the broad community of interests, and to win them over for the organizations capable of protecting their interests. This implies the possibility of speaking freely to the great masses. This implies freedom of assembly and of the press. Without the help of the press, it's absolutely impossible to unite a huge mass of today's wage laborers into organization and to get them into the level of unified action. End one quote from Kautsky. For all these reasons and more, there is no worse sin for the social democratic point of view than to disparage the crucial role of political freedom, although we see many such disparagements, nay, 19 years after this book was written. Quote, where the working class bestirs itself, where it makes the first attempts to elevate its economic position, puts in political demands next to purely economic ones, namely demands for freedom of association, of assembly, of the press. These freedoms have a great significance for the working class. They're among the conditions that make life possible and to which wholly unconditionally owes its development. They are light and air for the proletariat, who lets them wither or withholds them, who keeps the proletariat from the struggle to win these freedoms and to extend them. That person is one of the proletarian's worst enemies. It doesn't matter how great a love for the proletariat he feels are fakes. It doesn't matter whether he calls himself an anarchist or a Christian socialist or whatever. He harms the proletariat just as much as any declared foe. It is the same as whether or not he does this from evil will or simply from ignorance. He must be fought against in the same way as acknowledged opponents of the proletariat. The history of the light and air metaphor is a revealing one. It can be traced back at least to 1865 when Engels wrote the Prussian military question in the German Workers' Party on the subject of proper relations to liberal bourgeois opposition to absolutism, a subject with obvious relevance to Russia. Engels gave this advice, quote, even if the worst came to the worst and the bourgeoisie was to scurry under the skirts of reaction for fear of the workers and to appeal to the power of those elements hostile to itself for the protection against the workers, even then the Workers' Party would have no choice but, notwithstanding the bourgeoisie, to continue its agitation for bourgeois freedom, freedom of press, and the rights of assembly and association, which the bourgeoisie have betrayed. Asterisk. Marxists have been very bad at listening to Engels on this point, on asterisk. Without these freedoms, it will be unable to freely move itself, or will be unable to move freely itself. In this fight, it is fighting to establish its own life element, to attain its own air it needs to breathe. That is from a February 7th letter in the Marx Engels work, translated, I believe, by Lars Lih himself. In 1882, Engels wrote a letter to Kautsky in which he remarked, quote, Polish socialists who failed to put the liberation of the country at the forefront of the program remind me of those German socialists who were reluctant to demand the immediate repeal of the anti-socialist laws and freedom of association, assembly, and the press. To be able to fight, you must first have a terrain, light, air, and elbow room. Otherwise, you never get further than a chit-chat. Cough, cough. Or a X post. Whether he got the phrase from the Prussian military question or Engels' letter, Kautsky used it when he wrote the Erfurt program in 1892. The Russian Social Democrats immediately understood its application to their own situation. In 1897, the underground Social Democratic paper Rabochia Gazeta, the workers' newspaper, wrote, the Russian movement still tightly held in the iron grip of governmental oppression. As living beings need air, we need political freedom. Without achieving the freedom of strikes, assembly, union, speech, and press, without achieving the right to take part in the administration of the country or in making its laws, we will never cast off the chains of economic slavery that oppress us. This is why the struggle for an autocratic government, struggle with the autocratic government for political freedom is the most urgent task of the Russian worker movement. In 1898, the abortive First Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, RSDWP, declared that Rabochia Gazeta was the official slogan of the new party, although the paper was never able to publish another issue. The First Congress also issued an influential manifesto by Peter Struve, I think. In this document, the first official programmatic document of the RSDWP, I don't know why I pronounce that German. I don't know how to pronounce that in Russian. So RSDWP, we read the political freedom is a necessity for the Russian proletariat as fresh air is for healthy breathing. It is a fundamental condition for the free development and for its successful struggle, both for partial improvements and for final liberation. In the first issue of Iskra, which came out in 1900, the same point is hammered home using the same metaphor. To complete the circle, Kautsky repeated the same metaphor in his Socialist Revolution, published in 1902 and promptly translated into Russian with Lenin as the editor. We now understand why it was fatal for the Russian Social Democrats to be labeled as economists. An individual or group who really did argue that political rights were unimportant, or there was no part of social democracy's job to fight for them, or that political goals should be restricted to economic legislation, such a person, if the charge was held, was not a moderate. Social Democrat, and certainly not, as some scholars seem to think, a more orthodox Marxist than his political opponents. Nor such a person had read himself out of social democracy altogether. He lets political freedoms wither or withholds them. He keeps the proletariat from the struggle to win these freedoms and to extend them is one of the proletariat's worst enemies, unquote. Thus, the nationwide political party, not a nationwide economic organization, was the highest form of class struggle. See, that's why you need more unions, I guess, according to this point. I think you do need more unions, but we'll come back to that maybe eventually. Kautsky rather extensively defended the crucial role of the Workers' Party, quote, the adherents of trade union only is more conservative even when they are put on the radical errors, while in contrast, other workers' parties are revolutionary by their very nature, when their attitude are indeed the awareness of their members is moderate. The creation of a nationwide and effective organization with a political or economic has implications that were rejected by the anarchists and old-style liberals of Kautsky's time, but accepted by social democrats. The social democratic movement required, quote, permanent organs in the course of growth, a set of professional bureaucracy in the party as well as in unions, which it cannot function, which are necessary for it. We must continue to grow and obtain the duties that grow in importance. The bureaucracy consists not only of salaried officials, but parliamentary representatives and party journalists, coupled with the function of divisive labor and the spirit of discipline unique to the worker class organization. These organizational imperatives were partly the result of the capitalist transformation of society and partly a necessary condition of any effective fighting organization. Quote, one finds these features present at any time that large-scale masses are fighting for a weighty battle prize, and where victory can only be won with strictest coordination and most decisive unity of action, all tending towards the same end. Thus, Kautsky laughs at liberals who excoriate the trade union tyranny, but also vote at their party's call and never think of thinking them for themselves at all. Cough, cough, Democrats. Equally ridiculous are anarchists who sneer at the discipline of parliamentary parties while praising trade unions, proletarian trade unions, as the home of the unconstrained, because, of course, trade unions are organizations. In order to combat the dangers inherent in this situation, representative democracy within the party is also required. But representative democracy is in its way just another manifestation of the modem division of labor and the spirit of voluntary discipline. Any effective nationwide political organization will follow this imperative. Our century is not only the century of the parliamentarism, but also the century of party congresses. Leave it to the anarchists to the absurdity in assembling in party congresses in order to denounce the inevitable corruption of representative democracy. I mean, that sort of constraint's kind of interesting to just throw in there as an insult. I sometimes wonder if this book wants to be a scholarship or a polemic. I mean, I guess all books are a bit of both, but Marxist books tend to have a tendency to obscure those lines more than most, even at the expense of factual and conceptual clarity. But Lars Lih is doing a lot of interesting work here, so we should continue. We're going to do 2 more paragraphs and we'll stop. But the worker class parties have a better chance than the others of keeping organizational bureaucracy under control, precisely because the proletarian sense of discipline, I guess, from the shop floors. This sense of discipline does not only mean the workers are good at following orders. It means also that workers will stand for no nonsense from party officials, parliamentarians, and journalists, which politicians and party officials don't tend to like. The class origins of the party spokesman is no predictor of their behavior. Middle-class activists have been among the workers' best defenders, while worker activists have been sometimes betrayed their class because they need patrons. What is crucial is that workers' ability to constantly oversee and influence those who speak in their name. Neither the middle class nor the parliamentarian classes of the people, peasants and urban petty bourgeoisie, are capable of such organizational discipline. Social democratic political organizations are not powerful, not only because they are in modern large-scale organizations, not only because they are proletarian organizations that understand the value of discipline, but also they are social democratic parties and thus inspired by a grand historical mission. So be it they believe in things, and that's why they work better. Also, the shop floor is what organizes workers to be better. That's a problem when there's a lot less influence of the shop floor. Only a few years after the Erfurt Progress, Edward Bernstein became a tourist for the epigram, everything, the movement is everything, the final goal is nothing. We can understand the horror occasioned by the epigram when we look at the Erfurt program and parliamentarianism, both written prior to any revisionist controversy. It's of Kautsky's insistence that the final inspiring goal was the unique source of strength for the party in its ongoing day-to-day struggle. Any workers' movement, especially when operating under the oppressive environments of a semi-absolute countries like Germany and Austria, was going to face the heartbreaking defeats as well as victories. The only thing that can prevent these failures from wreaking devastating demoralization is a firm sense of the big story in which all features are no more than passing episodes. After class struggle is transformed by the fusion of the socialist and the worker movement, quote, the worker movement now has aim to which it visibly comes closer. Now all sides of the struggle are significant, including those that do not bring any immediate practical consequences. If only they further the self-awareness and prestige of the proletariat, its camaraderie, unity, and discipline. Now many battles that seem to end in defeat is equivalent to a victory. Now every strike and rejected legislative proposal would have served the interests of the proletariat as a step forward towards the aim of achieving the existence worthy of mankind. Kautsky's mention of prestige and human dignity point to larger themes, one that communists struggle with later on. I mean, the inability of later communists to refer to human dignity or workers' dignity is actually something that's often talked about in the middle of the 20th century after the Soviet Union abandons it basically as not scientific. Faced with the formidable self-righteousness of Victorian bourgeois civilization, a worker political party faced with the life and death problem protecting what we might now call worker self-esteem. Kautsky argued that scientific socialism provided a goal that was superior in its sweep and generosity of the vision of bourgeois parties. Not only that, it provided the necessary confidence that the goal could and would be achieved. A lot harder to pull now that we're like 100 and something years into this process and it hasn't happened in the places where there are the most developed economies and are where there are the most workers outside of places that achieved this through peasant peoples war. The only firm sense of the final goal could give the worker self-respect and respect of other classes. The final goal was the only thing that made the unified nationwide class party even feasible. I mean, if such a thing was actually true, if goals were the only thing to make parties feasible, there'd be a lot more parties than the Americas. We'll continue this. We have probably a few more pages left. We're going to stop here. Like and subscribe, hit the bell, and dream of a better tomorrow. Protect your peace.